During the 1920s, in an effort to confront an Arab majority that was becoming increasingly wary of the growing Jewish influence, Jewish militants formed an underground militia known as the Haganah, or Self-Defense Force. From 1924 to 1939, the rise of fascism in Europe produced an accelerated influx of Jews, bringing the total Jewish population in Palestine up to 30%. Throughout the 1930s, sporadic violence erupted between the Arab population, Jewish settlers, and the British security forces, claiming the lives of over 500 Jews and 2,000 Arabs. During World War II, some 60,000 Jews fleeing Hitler managed to seek refuge in Palestine, and by the end of the war they had created a militia of over 65,000 men, and guerrilla groups, such as the Stern Gang, were targeting the British administration with bombings and assassinations. As their mandate in Palestine was about to expire, the British sought help from the newly formed United Nations to create a solution to the impending crisis in Palestine. And in 1947, a UN plan to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab sectors was passed by a vote of 33 to 14, with 10 abstentions. The Arab delegates walked out. Under this plan, UN Resolution 181, 57% of Palestine, mostly desert, was assigned to Jews, with the remaining 43% given over to Arabs. But the terms of Resolution 181 implied that the existing populations in each area had the right to remain and become citizens of the respective states, regardless of their ethnicity, and could not be coerced into leaving against their will. It even went on to say that Palestinian citizens shall, upon the recognition of independence, become citizens of the state in which they are resident and enjoy full civil and political rights. Persons over the age of 18 years may opt, within 1 year from the date of recognition of independence of the state in which they reside, for citizenship of the other state. Vehemently opposed to the partition of Palestine, the Arabs began to form their own militias, and neighboring Arab states readied their troops as the British forces prepared for departure. The stage was now set for a battle that would lead to the creation of the State of Israel in May of 1948, and the displacement of over 750,000 Palestinians as refugees. In the wake of the massive exodus of Palestinians from Israel, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 194 in December of 1948, establishing the right of return for refugees. The U.S. was one of the 35 countries voting for it. Resolution 194 resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live in peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for the loss of or damage to property which, under principles of international law or in equity, should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible.
Israel does not agree to give any compensation for any refugee. It's a principal question for Israel. It was a principal question in the negotiations. Israel does not accept the principle of compensation, of course not the principle of return. You know, the principle of return is a demographic issue. It's totally rejected by Israel, although you know, it was drafted by the United States, the right of return. And many people forget it, that it was a resolution suggested by the United States 194 and the United Nations. Anyway, Israel rejects the right of return and the compensation, because the notion of compensation means that Israel accepts the responsibility.
From the outset, Israel did not acknowledge responsibility for the refugees. In 1949, Mr. Iban told the UN that the problem of the Arab refugees was a direct consequence of the war launched by the Arab states, which were entirely responsible for that, as well as for other forms of suffering inflicted by that war, and that it was wrong to describe the refugees as having been driven out. Rather, they had fled in an atmosphere of fear, insecurity, and danger inseparable from war. Nevertheless, as a condition for its membership in the UN, Israel announced its acceptance of obligations to make compensation for abandoned lands, and gave a tentative acceptance of Resolution 194 by declaring that Israel did not exclude the possibility of a measure of repatriation. During more than 50 years since the resolution was passed, no Palestinian refugee has ever been repatriated. We asked Jessica Nam to explain why.
You know, the right of return is not a new concept, and it's not necessarily new at all for Palestinians. or specific to Palestinians rather. It's a concept that actually has a very long history. It's a concept that applies to lots of different groups, and even in the relatively recent modern era, we have lots of examples of refugees being afforded the right to return to their homes. More recently, for example, there are examples after the war in Afghanistan, Afghan refugees were allowed to return home. In Bosnia, refugees were allowed to return home. And there are just literally hundreds of examples that after warlike conditions or the actual consequences of war where a refugee problem has been committed and refugees are guaranteed and afforded the right to return to their homes. So it seems rather remarkable that all these examples where refugees are allowed to return to their homes historically for as long as we have recorded history, but for some reason Palestinian refugees are excluded from that kind of right, that kind of inalienable right, that non-negotiable right. For some reason it seems like Palestinians have never been afforded that right, even though all these other refugees have had that opportunity to return to their homes. And there's three places within international law that guarantee a refugee's right, and specifically the Palestinian right to return to their homes. There's the International Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees that refugees can return to their homes. There's the Geneva Convention, which governs the action of, the actions of the consequences of war basically during war and after war, which guarantees that Palestinians and the refugees have a right to return. And then there's UN Resolution 194, of which Israel is a signatory to, which guarantees that Palestinian refugees at the earliest possible time should be afforded the right to return to their homes. So it's not just to the country of origin, it's specifically to the village and home of origin. And so we have it basically enshrined at three levels of international law that the Palestinian right of return is guaranteed.
Dr. Ganan compares the Palestinian right of return to the Jewish law of return, which grants all Jews the right to settle in Israel.
The Jewish law of return is actually quite disturbing if we kind of look at it dispassionately. And what it basically says is that a Jew anywhere in the world has the right to return to the state of Israel, irrespective of their birth history, irrespective of their ethnicity, irrespective of whatever historical trajectory that they themselves have been. And it has gotten even to the more ludicrous level where recently a 400 Peruvian indigenous Indians were brought into Israel, into settlements in the West Bank, who were converted essentially a month before their arrival. These were indigenous native Peruvian Indians who had been converted to Christianity, who were going through very stark poverty conditions in Peru, and who were given this opportunity by the government of Israel to actually come into West Bank settlements if they converted to Judaism, which they did. Now that, in my mind, seems bizarre, because here we have indigenous Peruvian Indians coming to Palestine and having the right to go into a settlement on Palestinian land, and I, as a Palestinian, have no right to do that. It seems rather bizarre that, again, one ethnic, one religious group is privileged over another and is afforded the right to return to a land for which they have no connection to. Yet a Palestinian, like myself, whether they're Christian or Muslim, has no right at this point to return to their home. And frankly, that just seems like naked racism to me. And it's part of this racist structure that the state of Israel is built on, where one group is privileged over another. There are color problems, also, because if you look at the kind of racism that exists in Israel right now, there's a deep kind of racist divide between Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, Palestinian Arabs who are Christians, and Muslims who are treated as fourth-class citizens. And then you have this whole kind of color spectrum within Israel, like Ethiopian or black Jews, for example, are treated horrifically and kind of ghettoized, much like African Americans have been ghettoized in the United States and throughout the world. And at